Hello and welcome to the SMEFocus show powered by MTDCNC. I'm Mark Weymouth from the Sensor Specialist Plus Automation. I aim to continue the great work this show has done for over 200 episodes, championing the UK manufacturing sector and highlighting SMEs. My guest today is Alan Eklid, who is a passionate supporter of UK manufacturing. Alan has spent 20 years as a metallurgist, and for those 11 years prior to his retirement, Alan applied his metallurgist knowledge working for a patent attorney. Alan was also a STEM advisor for a number of years and would advise inventors on using the design process and intellectual property to the best. Hi, Alan. Welcome to SMEFocus.
Good morning, Mark. Nice to be here. Great privilege. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's great to have you, Alan. And it's nice to see you in high def, as we've only ever met on LinkedIn before. So it's not as good as virtual, but it feels almost like we're meeting for real. You've had a varied career, as my little potted introduction mentioned, so you've worked across manufacturing industries. Can you tell us more about this and where your love of manufacturing came from?
As a child, I always was interested in how things were made, how they functioned. My father was an engineer. We always did our own car maintenance, house maintenance, repairs, this, that, and the other thing. And it was just a natural progression. When I left school, I knew I wanted to work in the laboratory. And I found myself, after a little toing and froing, as a training metallurgist in a steelworks in Bradford. And for years, my eyebrows did not come down, in that my first introduction to stand by an electric furnace full of 7 tons of liquid stainless steel, the power, the excitement, I could not take it in for quite a while. And then go and stand by a forge, taking measurements, and each time the hammer came down, my feet jumped an inch off the ground. Or I would go to a rolling mill or the machining centre and watch men with great skill doing what to me seemed impossible jobs and to them was normal. And throughout my working life, people, mostly men, but not always, have given me their information, their knowledge, they've shared that with me, and I've never ever stopped learning. It's 60 plus years ago since I started work, but the thrill of it's never left me. And consequently, it keeps me inspired. And I look at LinkedIn and I see the progress and so on that UK manufacturing is making, and it still inspires me. I still find it exciting when I see a new development or an expansion or an improvement, shall we say, because most things are iterations of previous things. The patent attorney I worked for once explained it thus: you could not today make the modern car from scratch. It's only after possibly 130 years of so-called motor vehicles that each day there's a small leap, another iteration, a little tweak, a little development, and here we are today with what we have, such as it is, and who knows what another 5-10 years might bring. So that stood me in jolly good stead the whole of that time.
So you mentioned a patent attorney, and the block of time before your retirement you worked for a patent attorney. So can I ask you to explain probably what a patent attorney really does, and what your sort of role was, and I guess what are the uses and benefits of intellectual property as a business tool? And then finally, as this show sort of focuses on SMEs, can you try and apply that a bit to SMEs?
It's such a huge topic. I do a number of talks on patents, trademarks. Let me list what there is, and I'll come to the patent attorney's role in all of this in a moment. So the first thing that people think of are patents. They cover things, inventions, that have to be A, novel, B, in world terms, C, capable of commercial utilization, and capable of being produced, not just something fanciful. And then we follow on from that with registered trademarks. There are 4 kinds of registered trademark. There's a word only. There's a device, brackets, logo, close brackets, if you will. Then you can combine a word and device to make another trademark. And then you have a stylized one, like a signature or something like that. Finally, and one that's often underrated is the certification trademark, such as you see on many packaging devices of recycling for glass and that sort of thing. They are certification trademarks. And then you come to registered designs. These cover the shape of something, its appearance, not its function, purely its appearance. And that often applies to cars, for example, because some of them are distinctive. Fewer, I would argue, today are distinctive, but that's a personal view. There's unregistered design, which is a little bit complicated and perhaps not for today's conversation. Copyright. Copyright covers two-dimensional things: the written word, a piece of music, a script, a photograph, painting. Technical drawings could be copyrighted. And then is the company know-how that is sometimes difficult to protect, but that's where contract law can come into place. You can say to your employees, when working for this company, you undertake not to disclose how we might carry out a process in the factory, for example. So that's know-how that is very, very important and is worth logging anyway, because Fred, who always oiled the machine on Fridays, is ill that Friday. Nobody knows that Fred oils the machine on Friday, and it stops. So that's a very simple, silly analogy, but it's that type of thing. And then finally, when you've got all of these different steps in place, and there are many, you can license / franchise these should you choose to do so. So if you've protected your clever bit in whichever way is appropriate, or ways, because you can use several of these at once, you can then say to someone else in a different part of the world where you cannot operate, you may use my clever bit on this understanding that for every piece or item you produce, you pay me X pounds, dollars, yen in exchange for using my clever bit. And you see that unwittingly all around us, people are using licensing or franchising. So to get to that stage, you need to A, understand what you have, B, understand how you can protect it in what mechanism or mechanisms, and C, what is the sequence and or, as Winnie the Pooh would say, an order of doing things. And I'm a great believer as an engineer in an order of doing things. So you wake up this morning with your earth-shattering idea that's absolutely marvelous. You do not tell a soul. I cannot stress enough how you keep that to yourself. Confidentiality is key, because once it's out in the public domain, certainly with patents, that's it. You cannot protect something that's already known. So you get your thoughts in order and maybe sketch out a few things yourself, delineate certain parameters and so on, and you secure a free 30-minute appointment with a qualified patent attorney, because she is bound by very strict rules of confidentiality. So you can say to them, here is my idea, this is how it works, this is how I would like to use it, what, if anything, of this can I protect? If so, what? If so, how? And finally, and this is a question you have to ask, what are your costs, please, for doing this? And any patent attorney worth his or her salt will say, you can apply for a UK patent to begin with. The initial filing fee for that is X. Our fees are Y. And that gives you a year of untrammeled work before that is even published by the Patent Office. But it means you have got an application number, an application or so-called priority date. You can then, if you wish, start to talk to people because you've made your claims of novelty. And yes, you can do this as a citizen. You can do this yourself for free. You can enter the Patent Office system. They're very helpful people, and they will guide you through the process. But, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it's a very big but. It's like doing your own house conveyancing, your own divorce. God help you if you need to do that. It's extremely legalistic. I have had many inventors come to me with the first draft of their patent application, wave a piece of paper at me and say, I don't recognize this as my invention. And that is because of the arcane language that's often used. Nothing is flat, it's planar, for example, and it gets into jargon such as that. However, it's worth the money because you can plan your serious expenditure over 3, 4, or 5 years. When you make your UK application, it's 18 months before you have to decide, do you want to extend it into any other nation? So you don't need to do that today. You just don't need to do that today. And the 18-month time of your initial UK patent application, you then go into something called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, where you say, I am planning on extending my patent into different nations. And that's another period of time before you even have to stipulate which nations. So in between whiles, you can be approaching potential licensees or franchisees and saying, if I extend my patent into the EU or to Middle East or the African subcontinent or America, would you be interested in having a license on my clever bit? And would you be interested in paying the local patent fees? So you're using the patent system, but you're deferring as much as possible expenditure. Meanwhile, it's quite a large meanwhile, but meanwhile, you can be using the design process. I worked at the Design Council for 5 years as a manufacturing materials and design advisor. I loved it. It was absolutely marvelous. So you can be starting to look at, do I need to use a design professional, either product, electronic, ergonomics, medical, and with your patent application in your sticky little hand, you can approach these people and say, I have my patent application underway. I need to talk to you in confidence. And any design professional worth his or her salt will talk to you in confidence. They'll sign a confidentiality agreement, sometimes called a non-disclosure agreement. And then you can use their expertise to develop and add to your own expertise. You might need to bring in 2 or 3. If you remember the Carrymore rucksack, you may be familiar with that, for example. One of the expertise that they employed was, I think it's a physiognomist or a physiotherapist who understood how the shoulders, skeleton, hips, spine work, so that when the knapsack was in place upon your back, it was putting the minimum strain on this and that. And they developed a little saddle that would sit on your hips and pivot with the knapsack as you walked, reducing the strain on your shoulders and lower spine. And so incorporating all of that expertise, you then can make prototypes, you can test them, and then part of that then comes the thing about manufacturing. How am I going to make this? Am I going to make all of it? Am I going to make some of the components? Am I going to just assemble it? And so I firmly believe that nothing happens in isolation. IP is part of the design process. And I have 3 little conventions that I use when advising people. And the first one is, when presented with the problem, question number 1, how might I? How might I make a knapsack that doesn't make my back ache? Why? Because I don't want to be sued for people who use my knapsack and have a bad back. What's stopping me? I don't understand how the spine works. How might I find out how the spine works? And so it goes. So by using that, how might I, why, what's stopping me process, you take this big question and you sort of compress it to the first step that I'm going to do along that path. And other conventions that I use, you'll have heard of the poet called Rudyard Kipling. One of his poems was, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are which and what and when and where and why and who. So you take that unused roll of wallpaper that you've got stuck up in your loft and you turn it upside down. You take out your felt tip pen and you do big balloons. Who, what, when, where. And you fill in or adjacent to all the who's, all the what's, all the when's. And it gives you a clue as to, again, where to start on this path of new product development. And IP is, of course, key to that. And when I was at IP21, I came up with this, I formed a thing called the Design Hub, and part of that was the design wheel. So the hub of your wheel, if you will, is the idea, the basic concept. The various spokes in the wheel are the different people that you incorporate at, during, end of promulgation of the idea. And that many spokes, some will stay, some will change. The rim of this wheel is then the design process that holds all of these different groups of expertise together so that it continues to roll and progress. And the floor or road or pathway that this wheel runs along is your IP. That's the basis of your product. So that it's not happening, you don't wake up one morning and think, oh God, I've not done anything about a patent. That should be very early on. And so you can manage a process. When people say, I have a design, and they use it as a thing. To me, design is a process. The product is the thing. Or the service, it amounts to the same thing. It doesn't matter, product or service, these things apply. So when I worked at the Design Council, my role was to advise companies on which methods, which materials or methods of manufacture to use as part of their design process. And I can't tell you how much I learned in that time. So my metallurgical training that I thought would only apply to metals, I suddenly realized I went, for example, a number of times to RAPRA, the Rubber and Plastics Research Association in Shrewsbury. Again, eyebrows up here. But I could apply my metallurgical knowledge and terminology to polymers. And the word polymer covers this vast field of materials, huge field of materials. And then I went on to learn about adhesives and wood and ceramics, all of which are part of the thing. And my original brief from the DTI was to inform people of modern and new materials. And I said, no, I will not do that. I will inform people of what I think is the most appropriate material and ask them to look at a range of materials. And if cast iron and silk and wood are still the best materials to use them. If it's fibre reinforced castings, use those. And it allowed me to cover the whole of the UK. I could roam wherever I wanted. What a job. And people welcomed me into their factories. Would I like to look at their new product? Yes, please, I'd love to look at their new product. And so I was able to do that. And I went on and I gave lectures in different parts of Europe on design, using the design process. So my move to IP21 after a spell at Business Link, you could argue was almost a natural progression. But before that, I had worked for nearly 20 years at IMI in Leeds, where we made copper tubes and copper alloy tubes. And that took me around the world visiting ships and power stations, refineries, hotel air conditioning units, trawlers. And again, this breadth, I doubt if I could have the working life now that I had then, that allowed me to have this breadth of information and people saying to me, try this, look at that. Have you seen this? For goodness sake, don't do that. And you have to be man enough or person enough, dare I say today, to say to someone, I'm sorry, I don't know, can you tell me? Would you please explain what X is? And I don't know about your experience, Mark, but in my working life, which was 50 years, people are generally happy to share their knowledge because most of it you don't get from a textbook. You don't get it from Mr. Google. You get it by applying yourself, keeping your ears and your mind open and being prepared to get out of your depth. I used to go into schools and say to people, don't be afraid to get out of your depth occasionally. Yes, you'll splash around for a little while initially, fine, that does you no harm at all. And then suddenly you will realise, do you know the East Lancs Road that links Manchester and Liverpool, notorious road that used to have 40 sets of traffic lights when I was a youth? I was driving home from Ormston. It was a wonderful road. And I was driving back on the East Lancs towards Manchester one night, because I'd changed jobs. I'd gone from testing metal to selling it. And for 3 months, I was floundering. I was out of my depths, genuinely. But I'd been to Ormskirk. I'd seen a valve manufacturer who used the high tensile brasses and the aluminium bronzes that the company produced. He'd given me a nice order. We'd had a nice lunch, a good chat, and I was driving home thinking, I can do this. I can change. And every 5 years, more or less, after that, I changed. And change is something, I think it was Ben Jonson said there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. I think there's a third certainty, and that certainty for me is change. And if you think, oh, change, oh, don't want change, like Canute, you'll get your feet wet. But if you think, oh, the tide's coming in, I can build a boat, I can build a raft, I can move up the beach, I can make a boat, I can make a jetty. And look at change, think, how can I make change manageable, make it work for me and benefit from it? We're in a period now of huge change. Much of it, I think, is hurried, but that's a personal view. We're dashing headlong into things that I think are precarious. Yes, we need to change. I don't doubt that, but it's the rate of change and are we managing it? And I don't think we are managing it as a world very well, personally. I'm an old man. It's arguably not relevant to me, but it is relevant to I have two great granddaughters, and I look at them at 1 and 3 and think, where on earth will the world be when they get to, say, their 20s? I have no idea. I have no idea. So change is something that we manage, and we manage it using all of the tools that I've been talking about now as part of the design process, which is, again, how I think of it. And being able, ideally, as an inventor, a company, a big company, a small company, to talk to someone who is neutral, arm's length, confidential, just to get your ideas, just to say the words out loud. For a number of years, I used to go once a month to the British Library in St Pancras. They would wheel in, they sat me in a little glass room and wheel in an inventor. I didn't know these people. I didn't know any of them before they presented themselves. And they would come with a brown paper parcel, a cardboard box, a supermarket carrier bag, or just an idea. I'd signed confidentiality agreements that covered myself, and I wasn't the only one doing this, there were other people doing it as well. And listen to the people trying to explain their idea to me, trying to understand it, and trying to see things about next steps, what the possibility was. Almost nobody had done any market research. The common phrase was, everyone will want one. No, they won't. There's nothing that everybody wants apart from food and water and somewhere to sleep. And the British Library have huge resources for market research. You, me, any citizen can go there and look at the most expensive market research reports for free. And they'll help you use their systems. Very obliging people at the British Library. And so that allowed me to meet all of these people, some of whom were absolutely barking. Some were stupendous in their complexity and the greatness of their idea. And like me and they were mostly average. But the fact remains that people were being inventive, using their imagination and wanting to progress. All of them had that, and I think that's tremendous. I really do. So I met some lovely people, and they would all ask me these questions naturally, and I would say to them, I will tell you what I believe to be the case. I may be wrong, but this is my genuine belief, and I'm sorry if you don't like my comments, but there's no point in me lying to you. To say to you, yes, Mr. Bloggs, Mrs. Bloggs, this is a tremendous idea, you'll make a fortune. Now, what is the point of that? You're not doing anybody any favours by lying to them. So I would try to be honest and straightforward, and hopefully feed them into the system where they would then go and explore the British Library, use the design expertise that we have tremendous ability in the UK, and progress their idea. Or sometimes the best decision was, scrap this one, I've learned more about the process, and I will apply that to my next one. And consequently, it's a step forward, I believe. That was when I was working for IP21. They allowed Ideas 21, which was the organisation that ran these surgeries. They gave my time to them pro bono, and many patent attorneys do that sort of thing. They'll allow some pro bono for the public good work. Some design consultancies will give you half an hour, and it's always worthwhile consulting as many people as possible before you start to spend any money. There used to be a graph that I used when I worked at the design council when I was giving talks that showed two lines. One was the money you spend whilst developing a product, but more importantly was the money you commit when developing a product. And in the early stages, when you're working on your idea, doing prototyping, sketching, thinking, playing, plasticine, pieces of wood, Lego are all good things to put forward ideas. You're spending very little. But once you start to develop serious prototypes and working models, you're committing more because you're eventually going to spend money on machinery and stock and all the rest of it. So it's worthwhile at the very early stages, in your workshop, in your bedroom, in the garden shed, wherever it might be, and playing with things before you commit yourself to anything. I know, and I've seen it many times, people get so excited, understandably, oh, this wonderful idea, and go ahead, and before you know where they are, they've started a patent going on something that's barely developed yet, and so they're describing the wrong thing. They've started getting prototypes and things made that are hopeless, and so it's this process, this thinking, how might I, why, what's stopping me, and who, what, when, where, why, and the design wheel, and it's very easy to get carried away. I do understand that enthusiasm, but life is what you make it. And then if you come up with the product, a simple one I have here. This is a device for dispensing sellotape. The lady that came with this at a surgery in Norwich, as it happened that day, came with the crudest prototype that she made with sticking almost matchboxes and cotton reels, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. And I introduced her to this process. I introduced her to 3 design consultancies so that she could choose. They did what ifs, if you will, and we chose one and went through the process. And she finished up getting a nice contract with Sellotape to under license, if you will. When she first began, there were 50 pieces of prior art for the dispensing of sellotape, 50 different patents. And she thought, oh, stop. But patent attorney I work for, they said, there's a way through this, a wiggly road through this, and devised the device, if you will, or helped her with the device to such point that she was able to secure the patent on that particular method of dispensing adhesive tape. And what I have there is a prototype she gave me years ago, and I use it still today. I have no idea whether they're available. I've not looked, to be honest. Simple idea, but if you're selling 100,000 of these a year in the UK, and maybe 250,000 in Europe, and another 250,000 in the US, suddenly those 10p's add up to quite a significant amount of money. So it's not necessarily the big idea that makes the money. It can be small ones millions of times over, like the Bic pen, for example, to make hundreds of thousands a day.
Can I ask you a different way to look at the design process, Alan? You mentioned that, or when we spoke, you talked about being doing failure investigation from your sort of metallurgical background. Are you able to sort of talk about some of the failures that you investigated and maybe bring that on to tips and hints for design?
let me think. I think of two. One was an investigation into the product that we made in the factory in Leeds that's sadly now gone. We made about 250 different recipes of brass and copper nickel alloys, all tubular. And one of the brasses that we made was trumpet brass, which was a very particular pure 70-30, 70% copper, 30% zinc brass for Boozy and Hawkes, who make the world-class brass instruments. And they always used brass from our factory because it was the very best. And they sent to me one day 3 examples of a valve chest from a French horn that was immensely complicated with all the 3 main pieces of tubing with lots of other tubes linking so that it would work on the valve chest. And in the middle of the bodies of these tubes, there appeared to be a defect. Your tubes are rotten was the opening gambit of anybody's investigation. Your tubes are rotten. Look at this valve chest that we've made. And they sent me 3 examples. And I always look, in investigating failure, I look for patterns, because by and large you find patterns. It's like a doctor looking for you for an illness. He or she will find a pattern that might be repeated from other people or within yourself. And down the bore of these complex valve nests, the same rubbish tubing, so-called, had produced a fault in precisely the same place on each tube. And I think, no, that's not going to happen. If it's a random fault, that ain't going to happen. And what it turned out to be, that where the tubes had been inserted to link the 3 main tubes and then brazed using silver brazing, not solder, but silver brazing alloy, a slight depression where the tube hadn't been formed properly and become filled with silver brazing alloy, so that when the bore of the tube was honed, and our friend Andrea knows all about honing, when the bore of these tubes was honed to take the valves, this tiny depression of silver brazing alloy presented itself as a grey fault. And I was able to show that this was a pattern. They needed to sharpen their tooling so they didn't create this depression when they assembled these tubes. And that resolved the problem for them. And they continued to buy brass tubing from Yorkshire Imperial Metals in Leeds. A second fault, if that is the word, was on the QE2 main condensers. I was working on the QE2. I'd worked on it a couple of times before. She had twin engines, twin turbines, twin condensers, which most ships didn't. Most had a single turbine and a single condenser. And a condenser is the part of a ship or a power station that takes the steam from the turbine, condenses it back into clean, pure water to feed it back into the boiler. And you've got seawater going through, in this case, if my memory serves, about 7,000 copper nickel tubes. And in a condenser, there's an area where pumps extract what they call incondensable gases, ammoniacal compounds by and large. And the QE2 had exhibited a few leaks in the condenser, which is bad news. And nobody wants leaks in their condenser, because it then takes seawater into the boiler, which takes copper into the boiler, which plates copper on the ferrous tubes, which leads to corrosion of the boiler tubes. And the QE2 chief engineer said, come and have a look. By the way, we're sailing to the Falklands in 3 days' time. So I was on the ship when there was this unimaginable work going on. It was like an anthill with people everywhere. And I was just one minute individual in the middle of this mayhem. And I didn't have time to do a full survey, but I was able to identify a pattern again in a particular corner of the condenser, which I knew would repeat in the sister condenser on the other side of the ship. And so I was able to map out to the chief and say, if you get a leak, here are the ones that are badly affected. Here are the ones that are semi-bad. Here are the ones that are just slight. So you can work out from that pattern again. Because he said to me, look, lad, I cannot send for the AA in a Force 10 in the South Atlantic with 3,000 squaddies on board. And it brings it home to just how vital marine engineering is and the job that all of these people do. I huge hats off to the marine engineers. So I was able to say to him, yes, Chief, here is the problem. Here's what you do about it. I'll get out of your way so you can do all the 1,000,001 other things you need to do to sail to the Falklands with all these people on board. And I was often put in that position. I visited 3 sites in Syria when Mr. Assad's father was in charge. This would be 84, 85. And whilst there, I was stopped in the desert and with the Kalashnikov up my nose, somebody looking for cigarettes and money. I got in a lift at Latakia that fell 6 floors and frightened me to death, bitten to death with mosquitoes the size of Spitfires. We drove from Latakia to Palmyra to visit another site, looking for corrosion. We were shot at by a tank that day. And when I was in Palmyra, this is this beautiful oasis in the middle of the Syrian desert, I phoned my wife and said, get the Yorkshire Post. I've got to go back to Damascus and then I'm coming home. I'll be home in about 4 days' time. And she said, oh, you've seen the light on the road to Damascus, have you? And so I stopped travelling for IMI. I've been shot at, held up, had great difficulty in many parts of the world. But, and this is another lesson I learned as a visiting engineer, wherever I went in the world, makes no difference, Mr. and Mrs. Ordinary showed me kindness, hospitality, and friendship. Wherever, makes no difference. Yeah. And so an open hand and an open face with whoever you meet. I've had some very humbling things happen to me that put me in my place, I have to say. And it teaches you a lot. When you come home, you think, oh, thank goodness I'm home. Aren't I lucky? Isn't life great? And I owe engineering, manufacturing, design, call it what you will. I owe that mode of life such a huge debt for the life it's given me and the people I've met, wonderful people. The thing I was taught to do at the Design Council that I found very daunting was to give lectures and talks. And I found that very difficult to begin with. But that was something else you can learn. So I've chaired a medical conference in Paris. What do I know about medicine? Nothing. So it was a design exercise. It was about using design in medical products, surgery procedures. And so it was something I could do. I've given talks to the British Council in Athens, again about design, and in Lisbon about bronze manufacture. You can do anything, almost, any of us, if you set your mind to it. I did not go to university. I went for 6 years to Bradford Technical College, 2 nights a week and a day release. That's how I trained as a metallurgist. The beauty of that, I was getting paid. I got paid £4 a week, a whole £4 a week when I started. And I could then go to Bradford Technical College, 2 nights and 1 day. And what I learned there, I could bring back to the laboratory where I worked. But I was also mixing with all men, as it happens, in different manufacturing industries. And we could each learn from one another and share our knowledge. And I could tell them what happened in the steelworks. They could tell them what happened in a switch factory, and so on. And so I don't subscribe to this notion that it has to be a degree. A cousin of a friend of mine, he's working in Lancashire at a company that's making components for aircraft manufacture. He goes, I think it's 1 day or 1 week a month, I'm not sure of the frequency, to Manchester University. So he's doing study and work and study and work. And he's progressing, he's having no debt, he's making a living, and he's loving it. And I'm sure these same things happen over and over and over again, and we just never hear about them, unfortunately. And that's a shame, because those are good news stories, and they're encouraging stories, and we need those. So I am not anti-university, of course I'm not, but it's what's appropriate. It's back to the design thing. What is the right way for you or for it? And one road does not suit everybody, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
When I leave you to
Sorry, Alan, I was going to say, before I get to the usual end question, while we're talking about reaching out and sharing knowledge, can I ask you just to tell people how they can reach you? Maybe give you LinkedIn address and your email, etc.
If people want a conversation about their idea, the best thing is to contact me at metasalix@mail.com. metasalix@mail.com. That's the best way. And then I can understand the question, shall we say. And whilst I'm retired, I do the occasional bits of advice, and happy to pass on what I've learned. As I said earlier, I don't think I could get this from a textbook. I don't think anybody could get it from a textbook. You'd have to read an awful lot of books and find yourself in difficult situations. Get it? How am I going to do this? The first time I went to a ship on my own, she was a huge ship. She was 444 meters long, a tanker. I was on my own, and I was presented with a problem. And for the first half a day, at least, I hadn't a clue what I was facing, to be quite honest with you. And I was sitting in the bilges of the ship, worrying away. And I went to talk to the chief. And I let heat exchangers on the ship that I had considered and looked at. And he said, "Oh, we have one in the funnel." And I didn't know they had a heat exchanger in the funnel. Another lesson learned. And that's where they heated the domestic water for the crew. From the exhaust gases going up the funnel, that heated the domestic water. And that's where the problem lay. So there's always something. So I understand and respect people's confidentiality because it's very, very important. And so when talking to people, I will always say, before we do anything, a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement, because that's the correct way to proceed, in my view. Does that answer your question, sir?
It does. The final question of the show is always, what do you have planned? What do you think is going to happen in 2025 for yourself? So what's ahead in the next 12 months?
If you want to make God laugh, make a plan is something I've often thought about. Plans at my age are nebulous at best, because approaching 80, you never know what's around the corner, do you? I shall continue to support UK manufacturing because I believe in that. I will take things as they come to me. I have no huge plan. I've got some things I want to do in the garden. I have another section I want to modify in the garden. I have currently no clients, and I don't know what may or may not arrive through the door. But in spite of the current situation, and I will say no more than that, I am still an optimist. To me, the glass is always half full, always has been. I cannot do with pessimism. I cannot do with negativity. And yes, you come across problems thinking, crikey, if I say we've done one complete self-build as a house that took 4 years, and 2 serious modifications to houses, each of which took 18 months, you'll understand that we're used to facing problems. And things crop up, because that's just life. If I might just end by telling this little aphorism. I was sitting on the doorstep of the airport in Brest at 4 o'clock one morning, waiting for the airport to open. Because in those days, airports didn't open all the time. I've been working on a super tanker in Brest, where I'd gone to investigate a failure. I won't bore you with the details. And I sat there thinking, how on earth do I find myself in this ridiculous situation? 4 o'clock in the morning, because the ship had sailed, so I had to leave the ship. And I've been dumped by a taxi sitting on the curbstone outside the airport in Brest. I think, oh, well, that means I can catch an early flight home. Life's what you make it. So I am optimistic about 2025, in spite of all the things we will not discuss. Does that answer your question?
Sounds good to me. Indeed, it does. Thank you, Alan. So I will wrap it up with the usual end of show words. So if you'd like to get in touch with a comment, a suggestion, if you'd like to appear in a future episode, then please email us at inquiries@mtdcnc.com or contact myself, Stuart Whitehead, or Joe Reynolds. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. From me, Mark Weymouth at Plus Automation. Cheers. Have fun.